Labadiena, su jumis laida Delfi tema, žurnalistas Vaidas Saldžiūnas. Viena paskutiniųjų šių metų Delfi temų. Šiemet mes kalbame metų pabaigoje kaip tik apie svarbiausią metų įvykį - karas Ukrainoje. Ir kalbame su žmogumi, kuris šitą karą, galima sakyti, išprognozavo, teisingai atspėjo, kada jisai daugiau mažiau gali prasidėti. Tai yra Michaelas Kofmanas, JAV Karinių jūrų laivyno analizės centro analitikas. Mes kalbėsime anglų kalba. Good morning, Michael. Good to have you here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your program.
You've been in Lithuania a couple of weeks ago, and you talked about cautious optimism on the Ukrainian side, the possible winter counteroffensive. So that was sort of a glass half full. When I talked to people who listened to you, they were actually, ironically, got the impression of a pessimism that, especially the long-term picture, that this war will drag on possibly for years, and perhaps this is not even the last Russian-Ukrainian war. So that's glass half empty. But what I'm interested in is in this cautious part that you mentioned. What is the key, in your opinion, for the caution and for the optimism? Is it the experience of the past 10 months, or is it the impression that you got in Ukraine while you were there, or is it the capabilities of the fighting sides, or the signals that the Russians, Ukrainians, and the Western allies are sending?
Sure. Well, first, regard to your first comment, perceptions are subjective and they are relative to your expectations. So it depends on what your expectations are for this war. Depending on what you hear, you may find that to be optimistic or pessimistic. And second, as an analyst, I've been doing this for quite a long time. I can tell you with high confidence, a lot of times I say one thing and people hear something else. And often they either hear what they prefer to hear or sometimes what they do not prefer to hear. That said, on the optimistic side, I would say that the Ukrainian military has consistently overperformed. And the Ukrainian military still holds a lot of the initiative and has prospects for retaking territory. Russian military has been able to stabilize the front lines due to mobilization, but consistently has shown that it has limited offensive potential, in large part because of constraints on artillery ammunition, in the quality of forces that they have, and in their capacity to employ them. That's the optimistic part. The cautious part is, of course, that folks are overly anticipating success based on what happened in Kharkiv. If you saw what happened in Kherson, it was a difficult fight. There was a good deal of attrition. You're seeing it again actually in Bakhmut. And because of that, they may have unrealistic expectations for how quickly the war might be resolved, how fast Ukraine can make gains, and also they may not appreciate the medium to long-term problems with supporting the Ukrainian war effort, which is very taxing and exhausting on Western defense industries, which are not optimized to support that kind of war. That's the cautious part. And I would summarize by saying that Ukraine has been winning, but it's far from having won the war, at least the way Ukrainians define winning.
Okay. Speaking of the counteroffensive and the constraints that you mentioned for the winter, and in general, the ammunition supply, the weather conditions, but do you see any potential surprises or scenarios that may develop, and what could be expected here, and what would be more important here, the direction, the intensity, the scale of any potential advances?
Well, the challenge with surprises, if you foresaw them, they wouldn't be very surprising. But war is filled with contingency.
Right.
What I can say is that looking out into the winter itself, I think we're now probably perhaps well into the attritional part of the fighting. As you saw, a lot of the fighting slowed down in November, December. We'll see what January and February brings. I'm skeptical of the Russian capacity for offensives beyond limited attacks, as you saw in Bakhmut, or counterattacks along maybe the Svatova-Kremina line. On the Ukrainian side, I don't like to speculate about Ukrainian plans. It's clear that they would like to continue offensive operations. Whether or not they're able to do that in the winter or in the spring remains to be seen. I know a lot of folks sort of anticipate a degree of momentum, right? But you essentially can't schedule Ukrainian operations for them. And they have to understand that this is likely going to be harder moving forward. The material assistance that brought Ukraine to this stage, to this point in the war, successful as it has been, may not be sufficient to allow further major gains. They may be incremental, they may be much more costly, and there will have to be changes, hence my caution. Both changes to the way Ukraine fights and also changes to the production capacity and the degree of material assistance that Western countries are providing. There's just one analyst's point of view.
Right. I just want to dwell more a bit on your caution and go back to a year ago, to December 2021, when Russian war was still in the works and the buildup of forces was pretty much clearly seen. And then Russia launched a diplomatic offensive with ridiculous demands to the West. Yet up until mid-February, there were many who were doubting that Russians will go for it. Maybe it's just another pressure. Maybe they will back down like in spring, like the previous spring. And yet you were very cautious about that with predictions, but also notably sort of pessimistic in that way. What made you believe that the war threat was more credible than it wasn't, and that so many observers really got it so wrong and convinced that Russia won't do it because it will be either deterred by the West or on its own unpreparedness to actually fight a war, the type of war that actually happened?
Sure. And look, I'll be honest, it's a bit of a long story, but I'll summarize it this way. I think over the course of 2021, the political indicators were there. There was a clear change in Russian tone towards Ukraine. The military indicators were much more visible. You could have seen them back in the spring of 2021, but certainly in the fall. The Russian military was positioning itself for a large-scale operation. I mean, it was probably the best and easiest case to argue. In fact, the challenge I faced, at least looking back on that time period, is I was surprised how difficult it was to convince people that a large-scale conventional war was coming when Russia had deployed upwards of close to 200,000 troops surrounding Ukraine with all the indicators that they were likely going to launch a military operation. And the third point that I'd make is that I think it was clear going into December that Russia's diplomatic effort was entirely performative, and that the purpose of this diplomatic effort was not to achieve a serious compromise in negotiations, okay, and that largely was stalling for time. At least that was my interpretation of it. Hence, I was pessimistic from November to December looking forward, and unfortunately, this turned out to be the case. But you can also look back and say that there were a lot of predictions about initial Russian military performance, specifically in this context, and Ukrainian military performance, and those were proved wrong. And I was one of the people that certainly didn't anticipate such great performance on the Ukrainian side, such poor performance on the Russian side in the context of this war, and also a 180-degree reversal of U.S. policy when it came to material assistance and intelligence support for Ukraine, which only happened once the war began.
Right. Okay, but one thing is for the general public to be wrong about something or be surprised, but a lot of European governments, let's just say, who rely on their own intelligence services, they may not have a crystal ball, obviously, but I mean, they earn a living for what they do, their job, and they did not believe that the things will unfold as they unfolded, that there will be a conventional war in Ukraine. Why do you think is that? And some people still do have those illusions that things can get back to normal with Russia.
You know, I think they had a different interpretation. I actually think the United States did the best job it could sharing intelligence, in fact, making much of it public so that the public itself could read across different countries. I feel that oftentimes folks get into confirmation bias or their process lead them to a different interpretation. And some of those are perfectly legitimate, okay? The one thing I'll say is that it's easy to impugn intelligence communities. I've never worked in intelligence, but I am an analyst by trade and by profession. And I'll tell you a good DC joke, that something's either a policy success or an intelligence failure, right? So the easiest thing to do is whenever anything goes wrong is to blame the intelligence community. Yeah. But you also often look back and you find that what intelligence folks were saying and what they were estimating may not necessarily have been categorical or as definitive as the way policy people typically portray it. And that was very much the case in the U.S. as well. At least that's my perception of how people saw the likely outcome of the initial Russian invasion.
Right. When a couple of weeks ago I asked you whether the Russian regime can allow itself a defeat, you said no, and Putin pretty much, his latest statements confirmed that his special military operation must continue. There's no alternative, no way back. Do you believe there's anything to break the will of the Russians in general to continue the war? Can anyone realistically, being in power in Russia, not necessarily Putin, roll back to February 23rd or even 2014 because of military defeats that Russia historically has suffered quite a few?
Sure. I mean, look, great powers or major powers lose wars all the time, right? You can definitely see the prospect for defeat for Russia. For this regime, of course, since they committed themselves to it going back in September, and they've burned a lot of their prospects for revising the war aims, I think it'd be very difficult. And I think this war is likely going to go on, unfortunately, even if Russian forces are, for all intents and purposes, defeated. There are two reasons for that, and this is a bit of a pessimistic take,
right,
but it's important to have a sobering view on it. First, it is typically up to the losers to decide when the war is over. That is, even if Russia loses the war, Putin can continue it via different means. He can continue a war of attrition. Second, often the way wars end only engenders another war. The current war you're seeing, the war of 2022, is a continuation war of the war of 2014, of the initial Russian invasion. And there's a fair chance that this war ends. In fact, actually, people who are calling for negotiations now, prematurely, when there's no basis for them, trying to artificially create a sort of ceasefire, it's only likely going to lead to another war, right? That's the reality. You often get a series of these conflicts playing out this way. Look to the wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, India, Pakistan, Arab-Israeli conflict, what have you.
But let's look at on the other side. What about the West? I know we talk, can Western help for Ukrainians continue? But another question is, when you talk about the collective West, obviously, most of the time people mean United States because of the weight the United States provides to the Ukrainian defense. But can West, including the United States, allow Ukrainian defeat now after Afghanistan and so on? And if so, what about implications that, well, everybody is concerned, especially in this part of Europe, that if Ukraine falls, we're next?
Sure, but I don't think there's actually a significant risk of Ukraine falling. I think a lot of people already consider the current situation to be a strategic defeat for Russia. In fact, I'm certain if you asked almost anybody on February 23rd what they thought the prospects were for the war, looking back on the initial Russian invasion from 10 months down the line now, I think it's fair to say that this is about the best possible outcome you could have anticipated, given how dire things looked back in February, right? That said, I think there is a real challenge for the West, and the challenge is one of endurance. Time's an important factor in this war. Part of the Russian strategy is to extend the war, to play for time, and to try to materially exhaust Ukraine, and most importantly, Western support for Ukraine. To me, actually, a lot of the challenges are not necessarily ones of political cohesion. Right? They have to do with material availability. There's economic support for Ukraine and long-term military support for Ukraine. Right? These are critical factors because conventional wars often come down to attrition, and they have a strong tendency to go on longer than people hope or expect. Right? Unfortunately, and that's why I'm giving a bit of a pessimistic take, that wars tend to go on longer than people typically anticipate. And part of the reason for giving this sobering view so that people make the preparations, that they don't rest on their laurels, and they don't assume that because of successes in the fall, the war's already won.
Right. Let's continue on that pessimistic note, so to speak. Is there a possibility, realistic possibility, that Russia can, in its, let's just say, spring offensive, militarily defeat Ukraine in the field with all their mobilization power in place, with all of their sort of last resources, or maybe not even last resources in place, and do what they intended to do back in February?
It's very unlikely. The correlation of forces really isn't there, and Russian capacity to use them isn't there either.
Okay.
Russia's capable of localized offensives, and it's clear they still have the objective of fighting for the Donbass, right? That's part of the reason for the fight over Bakhmut. But if you look over the course of the last 10 months, you'll see that early on in the war, the Russian military had a structural deficit in manpower. And the fighting for spring and summer, they were using artillery superiority to compensate for a lack of manpower. That led to a massive expenditure of artillery ammunition. The Russian military is a fires-driven military. It's culturally an artillery army. Going into the winter, after mobilization, Russia has fixed a lot of the quantitative manpower problems that they have, but they are now conserving artillery ammunition. They don't have the fires. So the big parts of the equation, in the spring and summer, they were missing one. In the fall and winter, they're missing the other. This is why it's going to be very hard for the Russian military to conduct a large-scale offensive moving forward. Even if they are able to reconstitute and, to an extent, effect a stubborn defense. To me, the issue is less, does the Russian military have the capacity for a major offensive operation, and more the question of what will it take for Ukraine to be able to retake territory moving forward, because it's not necessarily going to go like Kharkiv and maybe not like Kherson either.
Right. Another interesting thing is the Ukrainian fixation of certain types of weapon systems. It gives an impression that every single one of them suddenly becomes some sort of a Wunderwaffe that will change the course of the war. It's sort of a game changer. And I mean, you've been in Ukraine recently and in Lithuania. You might have heard that sort of approach. Is there any truth at all in all of that? And what can the fulfillment of Ukrainian wishes to obtain those weapon systems that they desire do for the war effort, maybe not necessarily in the immediate term, but in longer and transitional term, if this war drags on? And for example, now Ukrainians are getting Patriots, the JDAMs in the latest package. Maybe they will get something else in the further packages. But what does that mean for the war effort?
Sure. So capabilities make a difference. It's hard to fight a war without them. But a lot comes down to forced employment, to adaptations in the military. And at the end of the day, large conflicts like this, they come down to attrition of equipment, manpower, ammunition, and the capacity for both sides to replace and reconstitute. All right, so with that spiel put aside, the thing is that capabilities can make a difference. They usually make an impact when they're first introduced on a sizable scale onto the battlefield, then the other side begins adapting. The way you know that capabilities are not silver bullets is you find yourself, after being provided a capability, constantly asking for the next capability, right? Yeah. HIMARS didn't do it. Maybe the JDAMs will. If JDAMs don't do it, maybe ATACMs will do it, and so on and so forth. And the war is going to potentially go on like this. This is an argument essentially to say that, yes, they make a difference, but no, you shouldn't assume that the next weapon the United States or Western countries provide are going to win it. They are going to help. Okay, that said, with each capability come other choices. Who's going to maintain it? Where's it going to be? How long is the training cycle for? Where's it going to be repaired? So on and so forth. Is something else better, right? Might Ukraine need something else more rather than this particular system? Anyway, these are all complex issues, but there are entire organizations that are dedicated to working them out, that support Ukraine, that is, their job is to work the question of material assistance to Ukraine, to provide the training, to help provide the maintenance. And this is now institutionalized, I think, particularly in the United States side.
Right. Now, you talked a little bit about this, but Russia has made a lot of assumptions, wrong assumptions about how this war will look like, how Ukraine will collapse, how the Western support will dwindle over the course. But what are the key Western assumptions that we got wrong and we still maybe get wrong about Ukraine or Russia during this war that we should learn for the next year and maybe even further than that?
That's a good question. So I would say first on the economic front, I think people were very unrealistic of the timeline over which sanctions would have major effects on the Russian economy. I think a lot of folks just overestimated Western economic power. I'm not talking about those who technically specialize in these areas. I'm just talking about public and political expectations. Second, I think that as always, there are unrealistic expectations on what sanctions and export controls can do to the Russian defense sector. These policies take a long time to have effect, and typically they delay and make much more costly the acquisition of technology. But countries like Russia or Iran, you know, they have adaptable supply chains, transshipment points, and shell companies to which they can acquire components for sort of a narrow application defense sector. There's a couple other points that are worth mentioning. Well, in many areas, you could say, sort of broadly speaking, we overestimate the Russian military. There's some important points or caveats to that story, right? The first is that it's very clear that the Russian military is able to take a fairly sizable amount of attrition and still be on the offensive. If you look at total casualties of 100,000 plus personnel, loss of 30% plus of armored park of equipment, expenditure of a lot of ammunition, right? And continue to still trying to prosecute offensive. This is important, right? This means that war might not have such early culmination points. It means that people in the West, or most importantly, those who are responsible for defense planning in NATO, shouldn't just rest on the laurels, right? The Russian military may not be in a serious capacity, may not have the capacity to threaten NATO for some years. Who knows, it might take the better part of a decade or longer for them to reconstitute or rebuild military capability. But in defense planning terms, a decade is actually a very short amount of time, right? And in terms of Russian military capability, to what extent they rebuild it, that's less of an if and more of a when. And there are important lessons from this war, and for me, it's key that we don't learn the wrong ones. I'll conclude by this. Right. Defense communities don't do nuance very well, right? So if before people maybe thought Russians were 10 feet tall, and folks like me in my community were trying to say, look, they're not, there are a lot of problems in the Russian military. After this war, my fear is that many people now assume Russians are 4 feet tall, there's nothing to worry about, and don't need to engage in serious defense planning or investments and what have you. And that's very much not the case as well. And keep in mind that NATO will probably take quite a few years to recover just the stocks and weapons that have been provided to Ukraine in this war alone.
Yeah. Well, speaking of time, our time is pretty much over, but I just wanted one last quick sort of a yes or no question. One of the arguments that West not supplying Ukraine fast enough or in types and quantity required that Ukrainians want is not just about the capacity, the production rates, not only about the strategic reserves that Western countries need, but also for the risk of the escalation that it may be perceived by Russia. Is this argument still valid a year after, when Ukraine has a range of modern Western artillery air defense systems, very likely ISTAR information, and has not led to the escalation that's been feared? So is this argument still valid or not?
Can't give you yes or no. I will say it depends on the specific system in question, but it is far less valid than it was in the beginning of the war. I think those were major concerns at the beginning of the war. They are much less so now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. Mes kalbėjome su Michaelu Kofmanu, kuris yra JAV Karinių ir laivynų analizės centro analitikas, vienas garsiausių analitikų, kuris prognozavo šitą karą, ir mes apžvelgiam šiuos metus, kurie karo metai tikriausiai tęsis dar ir kitą metą. Na, tikėsime, šitas karas anksčiau ir vėliau baigsis. Tai ir viskas. Ačiū Jums, ačiū žiūrėjusiems, likite sveiki, gerų naujųjų metų, iki kitų kartų.